thank you everyone for joining us today for what's going to be a largely informal discussion of the documentary Preconceived and Crisis Pregnancy Centers, both in America, which is the focus of the film, but also here in Canada. My name's Ian Bushfield. I'm the Executive Director of the BC Humanist Association, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. If anyone gets too uppity, I will bounce you from the meeting, of course. But of course, at first, I want to acknowledge that I live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coquitlam First Nation. And I do want to highlight that today, as we are talking about crisis pregnancy centers and abortion access, we should be also thinking about the importance of reconciliation and decolonizing abortion care as we go through this. Indigenous people, particularly women throughout history in Canada, have been the target of reproductive violence. British Columbia and Alberta have maintained eugenics laws that sterilized many Indigenous women until the late 1970s. And today, Indigenous women, girls, two-spirited people face extra barriers accessing sexual and reproductive health care. There's a great document from the Abortion Caravan called Decolonize Abortion Care that came out a few years ago that really gets into some of the details of the injustices relating to these discussions. And I highly recommend checking that out. And I'll try and remember to put that in the comments in a minute or right now. Let me introduce our panelists. Most of you will know both of them. Joyce Arthur is the Executive Director of the Abortion Rights Coalition of Canada, and Teale Phelps Bondaroff is the Chair of the successful Access BC campaign for free prescription contraception, first here in BC and then across the country. He also serves as the Research Coordinator for the BC Humanist Association. We could spend a long time talking about both their accomplishments, but I'll leave it at that. Let's just touch on a few housekeeping notes before I turn it over to our discussion. Please keep your microphones muted. This helps make sure that everyone can hear the discussion. We've all done enough Zoom meetings by this point, but we will be saving lots of time for questions at the end and having kind of an open discussion as long as we're respectful for each other, and I'll try and recognize people at that. We are recording this portion of the discussion. I will keep all names and images of everyone except our panelists private for your own personal privacy, but we'll hopefully have a good content here to put on our YouTube and podcast later. And finally, as a small charity, the BC Humanist Association relies entirely on your donations to make this work and these events possible, as does ARC and Access BC, though neither of those are charitable organizations, but they still do great work and need money. The BC Humanist Association is in the middle of our year-end fundraiser, so please help us keep up this pace in 2025. And if you're not a member, go to bchumanist.ca/join, or if you already are, make an extra donation at bchumanist.ca/donate2024, or just /donate to support us. And with all of that out of the way, let's turn it over to our panelists and have a discussion. This film, Preconceived, focuses on crisis pregnancy centers, these anti-choice clinics in the US. It was a big film. I touched on a lot of things that I think the three of us knew a lot about, but maybe I'll start with you, Joyce. What was your broad takeaway from the documentary?
I was really quite impressed with it. I mean, it took me a long time to watch it, months, even though I had the link, because I was kind of afraid of being, thrust into this awful world of CPCs. But there were so many good counter voices, the Catholics for Choice and the clinic down there in Louisiana. So it was reassuring to see, the claims and everything being rebutted as we went along in the film. So that was great. And I think one of the things that struck me, and I included this in that little intro that I think you probably saw when you watched the film, was that, oh my God, like the CPCs in Canada, they're really no different than the ones down in the US. They do the same tactics, the same deception, the same lies. I mean, the US ones might be, I think they're more kind of open about it. Like what struck me about this film was, how openly religious they were. We're a Christian ministry. We're doing this for God. Abortion is a gospel issue and all these things that they were saying. And also just the paternalizing information, like almost open misogyny. Like that guy, that president of Heartbeat International, a couple different times during the film, he basically said, "Oh, like if women are presented with they think they want an abortion, but if we tell them about their options, they'll always choose life." So there's like women don't know what they want, they can't make up their minds, they can't make decisions. So very insulting. And so it really just confirmed to me, no matter what kind of front they put up, like, oh, we're so good and we help and we support. Really, once people get in there, it's kind of bad news and they have bad experiences. And that's the same thing that's happening in Canada, I think.
Teale, I definitely picked up on the religious element, and I know that's something that we discuss quite frequently in our research meetings. The one speaker in there said, I don't believe church separation of church and state is a real thing in the United States of America. What did you take away from the film as a broad overview before we start to get into some of the more specifics?
It was really interesting to contrast the religiosity that we saw between sort of Canadian CPCs and American ones. Joyce and I and yourself and a couple other amazing volunteers worked on a report where we looked at the websites of, what is it, 100 and oh gosh, it was 110 crisis pregnancy center websites across Canada, and we found some interesting results. But it was interesting insofar as many Canadian CPCs hide their religious affiliation, which I thought was kind of interesting. Whereas in the States, there's someone walking in, and I remember that one of the first, people in the documentary was saying they walked into a medical clinic, and I'm using heavy air quotes here, and the wall was covered in crosses, and that seemed jarring. I'm just trying to find the numbers on our yeah, here we go. So when we looked at websites across Canada, 74% of them showed evidence of religious outlook, but that means that like 25% of them were actively concealing their religious affiliation. And all these crisis pregnancy centers are affiliated with religious groups. What really stuck out to me, I think, was the use of language borrowed from our movement to sell crisis pregnancy centers. That was really shocking to me. And by that I mean like feminist rhetoric being used to respin and to repackage and to reframe crisis pregnancy centers. What Joyce was saying is really interesting because crisis pregnancy centers were actually an invention of Canadians. They go all the way back to Birthright, founded in Toronto by Louise Summerhill in 1968, and then they spread across the country and the world, and now there's thousands of them across the globe. So we have a little bit of responsibility as Canadians for it kind of originating here. And one of the roles of crisis pregnancy centers at that time, and they remain this way, is to serve as sort of this almost, and I'm using heavy air quotes again, sort of pseudo-feminist pressure valve for the anti-choice movement. And so you have an anti-choice movement that's dominated by a lot of religious figures, a lot of men, and a lot of the time women struggle to find a place in that movement. And so crisis pregnancy centers give folks, particularly women, a place to be active in the anti-choice movement. And you can see sort of insidious things from the names of the organizations, Women Helping Women or A Voice for Women. And this kind of framing, I think, is the most horrifying aspect insofar as they're stealing language from feminism, from the movement for reproductive rights, and they're providing a home for women in a movement that is strictly anti-women, that's viciously misogynistic. But they're creating this environment where, oh no, we help people by supplying child, clothing and diapers and ultrasounds. Isn't that great? We're helping other women. But the reality is they're not. They're lying to them. They're deceiving them. They're using a whole bunch of manipulative tactics. And to me, that was one of the most horrifying things, was just to see that um, manipulation and use of language from our movement to sell lies to people and to harm them actively.
Let's talk about those lies a little bit more and those tactics. There were a lot of really well displayed egregious examples of inaccuracies throughout the film. It was actually really impressive that they were able to get the heads of these CPCs just on the record coming and just saying what they're about and doing and agreeing to these long form interviews. What stood out to you as particularly egregious, Joyce?
Well, just all the repeated false claims. It's not just that they make false claims, but they say them over and over and over again, and they're propagated across the entire system, across all CPCs. And for example, the alleged link between abortion and breast cancer, basically completely disproven a couple of decades ago by science, but they still keep repeating it. And pushing fetal development like at the very beginning of the movie, we see these little rubber fetus dolls, and they're of course way out of proportion. I mean, first of all, when a person is pregnant, it's like a size of a peanut or a cashew or something like that, and it's no difference from like a tadpole or some other animal's embryo, right? So they make it look more human than it really is at that stage. And then the delaying tactics, which can be very, very dangerous for people. And we met the two young women who had gone to the centers and what they went through, and the lie about, oh, abortion is medication, abortion pills are banned in Texas because they're dangerous. Like, oh my God. And having to travel to Colorado for an abortion, just the sheer injustice and total inability to admit wrong. Like, she went back to the clinic at the end and said, "Why did you lie to me?" And they said, "Oh, I see you're still trying to process get over your abortion, you poor thing," as if abortion is always a problem. The emphasis on abortion pill reversal. This procedure that's sort of come out in the last few years and it's spreading rapidly. Like, I think most CPCs in the US are advertising it now, and it's growing in Canada too. Like, I think when we did that study, Teale, in 2023, we only found two, maybe three centers that mentioned it. It's a lot more now. It's growing. So that's very, very scary. And maybe something we can do about that. I don't know. But definitely we can learn by what the US CPCs are doing. And another thing too, the parallel is that they talked about Heartbeat International being this big affiliate organization. There's another one down there called CareNet, does the same thing. Well, we have one up here in Canada called Pregnancy Care Canada, which is the umbrella group for about 80 CPCs. But a lot of the CPCs up here are also affiliates of Heartbeat International or CareNet. So there's these American and international links as well, sort of linking them all together, and they're getting the resources from the same places, they're getting the lies from the same places. So they're all the same.
I want to jump in on that one there because one thing Joyce mentioned, which I think was really fascinating, is changes in the tactics and strategies that we see CPCs using over time. And this is why I really enjoyed the two comparative studies we've had of CPC websites. And we'll have to do one in a couple more years again, Joyce, because I think it's fascinating to see their tactics change. And one of the things that we noticed when we looked at how websites were portraying CPCs was these trends of, as Joyce mentioned, this new abortion pill reversal. We did only find it in two, but you can see other trends where there was actually less information available on websites now. There's these very bare bone websites with a bunch of stock photos of people sitting up against walls, looking at, looking sad. And it was fascinating to see how there's less information on websites so that they're kind of balderizing them to make it more palatable. And the focus is always trying to direct people to get on the phone, call us, make an appointment, call us. And it used to be the case that there was even more information on websites and you could see these overt lies. It was easier to disprove a lie when it's actively there on the website. But when they remove it and it's just, are you pregnant? Are you scared? Call us, here's some bare bone information and a couple of, loops on our website, that becomes that sketchy things are going on in those consultations. But one was interesting, and I took tons of pages of notes and had trouble organizing them because what we found is deception at every single level of these organizations' operation, whether it's how they present themselves. So you'll notice they have these names that seem like they're caring. They have logos. One of the things that we found in our study in British Columbia, or across the country rather, were a couple cases where CPCs would have logos and acronyms and names that were really similar to real clinics. And the example we were just chatting with before we started here was this documentary called 12th in Delaware, which tells a story about a crisis pregnancy center and an abortion clinic that are literally side by side. And these crisis pregnancy centers are set up, and they mention this in the documentary as well, that they're set up side by side just to lure people in. Oh, you turn right instead of turning left, and instead of getting real medical care, you're in a fake clinic that's lying to you. But you see locations, you see doctors in scrubs, or sorry, not doctors in scrubs, my apologies, non-medically trained professionals delivering recreational ultrasounds, but cosplaying as doctors and nurses. And then you've got lies told to patients, and Joyce's canvas, though, is the only other one I wanted to add to that list was the post-abortion syndrome, which we hear so much. And, there's this whole stigmatization of abortion that you can see throughout the entire documentary and embedded in the rhetoric of these anti-choice activists, and that further stigmatizes abortion. It's also a lie. Like, Joyce, what's the number? You told me this when we were doing our report of, like, the number one feeling that people have after getting an abortion is relief, and it was something like, what was the final stat on that one? I know you have that one off the top of your head.
Oh, how many people feel relief? It's a large majority for sure. For sure. It's
Yeah, it was like
like
over,
80,
yes.
90%.
That's
Yes.
what I thought. Yeah, it's a huge number of people, right? Because people are relieved they're booking a medical, treatment. There's other stuff too, like not just the manipulation. I thought was fascinating. Like Ian, you kind of already mentioned, and Joyce as well. But the ultrasounds. One of the women, she was flipping through her book of ultrasounds, and there was dozens of photos. Like she kept going back for multiple ultrasounds, and I thought that's a lot of ultrasounds. Why would you do that? Well, the idea is to humanize the fetus, to show people the heartbeat, to create that emotional connection between the mother and the fetus, or whatever stage of development it's at, to create that emotional manipulation that leads to people maybe being depressed after an abortion. It's not the abortion itself, it's all the stigma and taboo and layers of misogyny that might contribute to that. But the other thing actually I wanted to highlight too was some very insidious tactics. So whether it's the free baby things, so getting people in the door with free things, and then of course abandoning them once the child's born, pretty typical of far right ideology. But the blackwashing I thought was very powerful. And we see this where CPCs are intentionally targeting specific communities, particularly low income communities. And that's another form of manipulation. And you saw there was one line in the documentary which was poignant, which was, if it's only economics that's leading you to have an abortion, we can solve that. Now, of course, they don't, because the same people who oppose abortion also oppose social programs. But it was fascinating that they were just focusing on the economics of it with free things. And that to me was really insidious. The whole, like, it's $1,000 abortion, that's too expensive, I'll just have a child. But of course, that child's ultimately going to cost you tens of thousands of dollars, and the logic just doesn't logic out there. But yeah, I thought that was fascinating, where you see deception at pretty much everything they do, whether it's consulting with patients, how they present themselves, how they conceal their religious motivations and anti-choice motivations, all those kinds of insidious levels, which really shows why crisis pregnancy centers are such an insidious and dangerous thing.
And there's
It was
another thing I
really,
wanted to add. Oh, sorry.
no,
Another thing
I
I just
was,
wanted to add there about the privacy regulations. You probably remember seeing in there where the person at CBC was, oh, we abide by HIPAA. Your data is completely private. And it turns out, of course, and this has been, I've read about this before in another article, this data is all shared with Heartbeat International and all the affiliates, all the staff, thousands, whoever you can access this patient data. So it's not private at all. Plus, they're not actually bound by any regulations at all. They say that they'll keep your data private, but you can't trust them. And it's the same situation up here in Canada. CPCs are unregulated, and you'll see sometimes on their websites your data is confidential and blah blah blah. But there's no guarantee at all. And CPCs are known to do tactics like they'll start phoning people and harassing them, and please don't go for your abortion, and or doing prayer calls for people, and just really weird things like that.
The prayer
that was,
calls are a really, really problematic one, because what we've seen in a couple CPCs when we're looking at their websites is they'll have like a submit a prayer form. And some churches and places of worship will have these. And so people are praying for, insert a person's name here who is at risk for an abortion. Or what was the term they used in the documentary? The abortion seeking, or there's a certain terminology.
Abortion vulnerable.
That's the one. So, oh no, there's someone in our town who's abortion vulnerable. Well, it could be a small town. Like, how many people are, named, Samantha in Lumbee, right? And so suddenly you really do like sacrifice people's privacy in a very overt way. And that to me is also particularly problematic because of sort of the direction we're going in with the states, and that could potentially open people up for legal challenges or a whole bunch of other issues associated with stigma and even legal action.
yeah, that stuck out to me as I was going to ask about biggest surprises, but we've touched on so much there. That use of data is particularly an issue, as you mentioned, Teal, right now, because the timing of this documentary was so good in a way, right? It seems like it was made roughly around when they were debating the Roe v. or the decision that overturned Roe v. Wade, and they were able to bring in sort of the initial fallout of that, and the trigger laws that started criminalizing abortion everywhere. But when you start to think about that data and how now these clinics have data on people who might be set to commit crimes, which is to seek bodily autonomy, uh, it's terrifying to think about that and how this will turn out in the States. And we're
And the data is
thankfully in
being
a different
held.
situation in Canada, but
Well, and the
for
data is
now,
being held actively by people who want to criminalize abortion.
yeah.
I think that's it's not like the data is in a locked room somewhere. Who has the key to that locked room? Even if it was behind a lock and key, it's the key is being held by someone who actively wants to criminalize abortion, even though they seemingly denied in the film. So yeah, sorry, jumping on that one. I think the other thing that was really terrifying with the big data was how ads can follow you around the internet. And I know this will be the case. You accidentally watch 3 videos about baby otters on TikTok, and that's all you get for the next 3 weeks. But imagine searching for an abortion clinic near you and getting nothing but anti-choice ads on your social media, on all of your computers for weeks. That to me is a sort of terrifying Big Brother state, and you could see them almost, champing at the bit and excited about using big data to target people who are abortion vulnerable, and that to me was absolutely terrifying.
Let's turn a little bit more to Canada. Obviously, we've touched on a lot of the things that are similar, a lot of the tactics, and some of the subtle differences in terms of our websites being bare bones, probably because people like Joyce and Teale have been scouring over them and making it so public that they felt the need to scrape their websites down a little bit. But what are some of the other big differences? Like we've all looked, between the three of us, have spent a lot of time looking at crisis pregnancy centers in Canada. Where is room that we need to take a lot of lessons from this documentary, and where are things acting differently here?
Yeah, I mean, good question. There's just so much to talk about here. But I mean, I've always thought that the CPCs or the anti-choice movement in general is a little bit meeker and milder than the one in the US. And that's true to some extent, of course. But now we see, of course, the such similar tactics and the same resources and everything that they're using, the CPCs. So there's no doubt about the overall mandate and what they really want to do. And I want to go back to what Teale said earlier about how the CPC movement started as a way for women to get involved in the movement, but also is also to try and put a human face to the anti-choice movement, which was like really pro-fetus and is all about fetuses and the Bible and all that. And they thought, well, wait a minute, what about women? We're forgetting about women, and abortion hurts women. That's their sort of guiding principle, right? Abortion hurts women, so we open these CPCs to help women from the harms of abortion. And so that's a very similar mindset here in Canada. And basically, I think, uh, I mean, birthright is interesting. You brought up birthright because they're much less now than they used to be. Their influence and numbers have gone way down. And internationally, I think they only have a few in Africa as well as a bunch in the U.S. But they actually are a kind of very toned down, mild version of a CPC. In comparison, the CPCs that are affiliates of Pregnancy Care Canada, I mean, these centers have to sign, they have to follow like some rules and directives. They can only hire Christian staff and volunteers, and we're talking about not from the United Church. We're talking about fundamentalists, and you have to believe in the literal truth of the Bible and all that. Um, and they're never allowed to refer for abortion or even contraception. If they have any opportunity to proselytize to clients, they should do that, and things like that. And they used to have these directives right on their website at Pregnancy Care Canada. And when we sort of brought attention to it, and we had a whole report years ago from the Pro-Choice Action Network that publicized things, they took it down, and now it's like behind a password protected only for their affiliates. So, but we have been able to get a more recent copy, I think from 2017 is our most recent copy, and they say they've changed it, but I'm sure it's not changed very much. So it's scary. Like whenever I see that, oh, this CPC is an affiliate of Pregnancy Care Canada, then we know that they're beholden to all this religious claptrap, which is often not even on their website at all. So I think it's really interesting because down in the US, of course, I think they can be more open about, oh yeah, of course, abortion causes breast cancer and this and that. And whereas you don't see that very often anymore on CPC websites in Canada. It's only a few that go into it. Some of them will have like a long list of the risks of abortion. And the thing about that is it might be sort of roughly accurate in a kind of twisted sort of way where every surgery has side effects, but they exaggerate them and they don't put them into context or explain how extremely rare death is, for example. They just list it, death, side effect of abortion. And but as Teale said, the thing in Canada I think that they've moved to is just bare bones information. They just want to get you in the door, get you to phone at least. And it really raises a worry, I think, on my part, because they seem on the surface to be nice, and there's no hard to find misinformation on their website. But what are they actually saying to people when they get them in the door? And we think it's pretty bad. And I wanted to mention that we had started collecting stories from people who have been to CPCs. And so we don't have that many stories yet, about 7 or 8, but they are all pretty consistent. We're talking about CPCs in Canada, and they're all pretty consistent about having a pretty horrible experience and being lied to and told that abortion causes breast cancer and instilling guilt into people and going through fetal development. Oh, there was one story that a woman shared about. They took a doll, and this is how an abortion happens. They took a doll and it ripped off an arm and the leg. And do you want to do that to your baby? This is what they're saying, Canadian CPCs. And then you look at their website and they look like a clinic or something. And it's like, oh my God. And so it is pretty scary. And I think in Canada, the challenge is getting around that degree of deception, because even I can have a hard time. Like, I look at the website, is this a CPC or what? And I get that question all the time. I get it from reporters, and you have to explain, yeah, you can tell these like little reveals here and the kind of the phrasing that they use, the pictures that they use, what they don't say. For example, they're never gender inclusive. They never have any services for LGBT people. It's always it's about women, 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 women. And so we had this whole document on our website called "How to Identify Fake Clinics," and it tells you what to look for, how to identify whether the CPC. But it's almost kind of a shame that we have to do that, because it makes our job more difficult to try and get them regulated, right? So
We also
That was
have, we've done a walkthrough. So we've done a bunch of videos where we walk through different CPC websites and identify problematic features. And sometimes there's a disclaimer, but it's in tiny, print at the bottom of the screen. I just wanted to build on what Joyce was saying, because one of the things we've noticed is CPCs, it's very hard. Some of them are very obvious and some of them are very difficult. And many of them have programs other than simply offering crisis pregnancy centers for people who are experiencing unplanned pregnancy. So one of those programs might be prenatal or parenting classes. And what you'll actually find is these programs are so deceptive that they will receive money from governments. Like, they will receive funding from legitimate secular NGOs with funds to give, or from local governments, or from provincial and federal grants, because they're like, well, it's prenatal care. Who wouldn't want prenatal care? Who wouldn't want to do parenting classes? But of course, this is being run by an organization with a very specific motivation, rather than and as Joyce mentioned, a very specific motivation around, like, what does a family look like and how should families be raised? And we've also found a lot of sex education programs. So you'll actually see the same organizations, but very often a different website that's completely severed from the Crisis Pregnancy Center, and you have to follow a bunch of breadcrumbs to get there. They'll be running sex education programs in schools. I was a sex educator for a couple of years in high school. I taught grade 9 sex ed, and we always try to bring in speakers, because it's a little less awkward when your teacher's, giving you certain parts of the lesson plan. And if you aren't being careful, the websites for these organizations look very much similar to the normal, guest speaker to come talk about sex education. And suddenly you have someone coming in talking about, very much, anti-abortion rhetoric, promoting abstinence-only sex education. They're not calling it that anymore. They're now calling it sexual integrity. So they keep reframing their terminology to conceal, as Joyce mentioned, the glaring problems that we've already identified. Well, everyone knows abstinence-only sex education is a complete and utter failure. There's reams of empirical evidence on that, so we won't call it that. We're going to call it something different. We're going to call it sexual integrity. And as Joyce mentioned, there's no mention of LGBTQ plus youth. It's simply this stripped down, very religious focused, but maybe the religious aspect is hidden. And we found numerous examples of, quotes about these programs, like little testimonials from public school teachers who had somehow just invited these folks into their classrooms. And I think I keep using the word insidious, but I think that's the best one to describe crisis pregnancy centers. They really are tricksy, and they're constantly changing. And one of the other things that we found when we were doing our research and our ongoing report that we're working on for British Columbia is they're always changing their names and locations. Usually as organizations, you want some brand identity. Like, we're the such and such group. We've been using the same logo and slogan and name for 8 years, so people know who we are. That's not the case with CPCs. They're always changing their names ever so slightly, adjusting their logos, moving locations, and it's tricksy, it's slippery, and it just sort of undergirds the overall approach that these organizations take.
yes, ARC has a whole spreadsheet of all the CPCs. We have an entire extra column devoted to other names, previous names, and that column is pretty full. So it's really surprising. And I wanted to mention, sorry, I'm very tired. I didn't sleep well last night, so I'm losing my train of thought. But it was about the sex ed education, right? So in our research, and we, like, as part of our spreadsheet of data on the CPCs, 42% of CPCs across Canada have some kind of sex education program, and that they offer to schools. Now, they may not all be in the schools, but they're trying, and many of them do get there. And the reason that happens, and we did some deeper research in BC about why that happens, it's because, of course, teacher training is underfunded. There's no special funding for sex ed. It costs money to bring in professionals, proper people to teach it. And so the teachers are often uncomfortable to teach it themselves. It might be the gym teacher, for example. So they go online, they start searching around, they find this great website from this, like sexual integrity or whatever it is. And they say they're going to teach to the curriculum, but the curriculum is a little bit vague. So there's a lot of loopholes that they can get in under. And that's how they get into the schools. So, I think they're teaching like traditional gender roles. They have nothing for the LGBTQ youth. And even I used to think, years ago, well, if they have their parenting programs or whatever, that's fine. But actually, Teal's right. I mean, everything they do is from this traditional biblical morality perspective, right? Patriarchal, right, and woman's proper role and all that stuff. So none of it is an acceptable reason for them to get any funding from government or foundations, but they often do, insidiously.
Hmm.
One other thing
Joyce,
just
you
to
mentioned earlier the share your CPC story thing. I put that link in the chat so that people who have done that can go to that, or at least share it with friends who they might know of who've done that. I've also put the link to the BC Humanist Association's volunteer page where people can go and just click that you want to help with campaigns. We're looking for a few more people to help us finish off some of our current work on crisis pregnancy centers, hopefully early in the new year. It's been a long time coming on that. Beyond that, there's always things you can do. Talking to your politicians is very important. Right now, one of the questions I wanted to put to you to kind of close off before we switch over to the broader discussion, because there's a lot of people here and I do want to make sure we're kind of closing off towards 5, but giving people lots of time, is the regulatory challenge changes in Canada. So Canada, thankfully, doesn't have a lot of the same kind of misinformation laws that we've seen in the US, but those are always a threat. So it's so important to talk to your politicians, your, all the way from school board to talk about these education issues, all the way to your member of parliament and the prime minister. Right now, there is a federal, it's not fully a bill yet, but there's a plan to do a bill that would increase regulation on crisis pregnancy centers and say that if they have charitable status to maintain that and they don't do abortions, they need to be explicit about that in all of their advertising, including billboards and social media, which they run quite regularly. So we'll definitely be promoting that bill if it hits the floor, if this House of Commons logjam filibuster ever breaks, but it is a positive step. Anything else either of you want to add on
I
that?
want to jump in with one other thing, because you're asking about differences between Canada and the United States, and I think, obviously their political environment is a bit different. But one thing that I think, and Joyce already touched on this a little bit, is this trend to online CPCs. So when you have a brick and mortar store, they have to exist in the real world. They have to pay taxes, maybe. They have to have staff that show up, maybe. But we're seeing, online little boxes, like you can have a chat bot talking to someone on a CPC website. But the one that is really dangerous, so it's really hard to deal with those because they're online entities and they may not live in a specific jurisdiction, so they're quite slippery. But the other one are vans, so mobile crisis pregnancy centers. And we saw a couple of shots of those in the documentary, and they didn't talk about them. There was a fascinating article written by a couple of academics who were trying to count the number of crisis pregnancy center vans in the United States, and they just couldn't. And the whole paper, it's an academic paper where they set about trying to do this, and they realized they just couldn't. It was unmanageable because they're always moving around. They're incredibly slippery. They can park in front of schools. They can park in front of real clinics. And that was, I think, an area where advocacy is only begun. I know Joyce and I and you and I and some of our research team have talked about this a lot, where, like, how do you deal with a crisis pregnancy center van that can move anywhere, that could drive across the country in an afternoon, and suddenly it's in Chilliwack, and then it's down in, Three Hills, Alberta. And so that was very worrying. And I think that's something that I would put on people's radar as something to be concerned about, because they're very slippery and they're even more harder to track and manage, and they can move. So you can't even, pin them down in one location. So I thought that was something that was, we're seeing in Canada now. There's a couple of CPCs that are fundraising to get their own vans. And it's something I think it's going to be on our horizon for sure.
Yeah, that is an issue. I think, anything they're doing in the States, it's coming up to Canada as well. We saw that with abortion reversal and also like medical services. It's growing in Canada. Like most CPCs are just volunteer run. They're doing this peer counseling or whatever. But there's several of them, 3 or 4, that have ultrasound machines that they're giving these recreational ultrasounds, which, and you mentioned Teale earlier how that center she had a whole bunch of pictures. That's kind of risky medically, and medical societies in Canada, the SOGC, the Society of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, they have a whole policy against recreational ultrasounds, that it's risky and shouldn't be done. So that's one angle that we could pursue, and we are trying to pursue that, like, not that CPC should not be doing medical services. The other service they often do is STI testing. I sometimes notice when I look at their websites, all the stuff that they do, sexual services, if they do STI testing, it's all around the negatives of sex, right? STIs and don't have sex and abstinence. And so it's all very anti-sex, which is interesting. But
And that was a way of getting people in the door too. Like in the early 80s, when pregnancy tests were more expensive, the free pregnancy test was something that you used to get someone in the door. So I was like, oh, I'm not going to pay for a free pregnancy test. I can go to the crisis pregnancy center and get one for free. Now you can find them at the dollar store. And so they've been shifting their ways of inducing people to come in with other free services like ultrasounds or free, one of the things they made a really big point about in the documentary was free baby supplies. Of course, that dries up once the baby's born, but you can see a lot of groups will do that. And the one that's really problematic is these earn while you learn programs where people will come in and take a class, whether it's prenatal or parenting or what have you, and they earn credits they can spend in the store to buy baby items. And it's this very problematic approach. And then the lessons themselves, there's like lessons for him and lessons for her, and they're all very gendered and profoundly reflecting this very Christian, very evangelical, far right Christian outlook on what family should look like. So there's a whole bunch of problems to that as well.
I think I'll just give you both like 1 more minute each for concluding thoughts on the film, and then we can turn to a broader discussion. I'm sure more will come out, but maybe first, Joyce, broader thoughts on the film, the status of crisis pregnancy centers and reproductive rights in Canada, and what should people do?
Yeah, I mean, the film is really a wake-up call to, it raises awareness about what the CPCs are doing. And I think that maybe one of the most important things, given how deceptive they are, just making sure people are aware, hey, this is a CPC, this is what they stand for, this is what they actually believe. You can't believe what they say on their website. And I think we've succeeded in doing a lot of that in Canada, raising the awareness so people are more aware of them. People can still be fooled by them, but we're hoping to continue, minimizing that in the future. And so public awareness is a big thing, and just spreading the word and telling your friends not to go there. I mean, there was that scene in the film, for example, where she went to the CPC because her friend, well-intentioned, gave her a list and didn't realize that they were CPCs, right? So that's the kind of thing we want to try and avoid and make people more aware of it. And I think in Canada, obviously, we're much luckier here compared to the US in so many ways. We don't have the laws to worry about. I mean, I think down in the US, as kind of mentioned in the film, I mean, the funding that the CPCs are getting down there is just crazy. And this funding is being taken away from needy families and then given to the CPCs, who are then making the clients kind of earn it, the earn while you learn thing, which is crazy. And of course, with the criminalization of abortion, that database, can easily end up in the hands of Republicans, and so they can start actually identifying women. It's not true they don't really want to criminalize women. They do, and they will, and they don't care about women who are already criminalized down there in the US. It happens a lot. If they're being criminalized under other laws, like child protection laws and things like that. So we don't have that kind of stuff to worry about in Canada, but our legal situation is pretty strong. But seeing what's happened to the U.S. and some other countries, and the creep of fascism and extremism, we can never ever rest on our laurels. We have to be really, really vigilant, and it could happen here. I mean, we're looking at a Pierre Poilievre government next year. Like what's going to happen. We have to be prepared. ARC is preparing an election toolkit. We'll have voters guides and things that people can do to sort of, have their say during the election and educate people about the threats that a Poilievre government could pose to abortion rights in Canada. And I think there's a lot. And I don't think he's going to criminalize abortion, but he's so many other things he could do. And I think the big thing is like take away funding. We have a lot of funding now going towards sexual and reproductive health, including abortion. Like NAF Canada is getting funding to train providers. It's all really nice. I mean, the instant Poilievre gets in, that funding will be gone, as well as funding for safe abortion abroad. We're saving lives in Africa and other developing countries, and that money would be gone or repurposed or something. And all the sort of policy level changes that could be made, like they'll just stop enforcing the Canada Health Act. Nothing will be done to make provinces, provide sexual and reproductive health services and abortion. So there's all these things that we have to be really be careful of.
And Teale, last thoughts, and then I'll
Yeah,
pause.
one of the things that Joyce was mentioning, I think, is really worth underscoring as well, is this money. Like we're talking big money. There are, when you see the stats, what was it? Like, there are 3 times more CPCs than actual real clinics in America. And we had our numbers from our study here, Joyce. What was it? Well, significantly more. There we go. You have 143 CPCs, 146 CPCs in Canada. That's a lot. And that's big money. And we are very small not-for-profits or NGOs who are fighting against these forces. So if you were looking to make an impact in a world of rising misogyny and Christofascism, supporting small groups, small but mighty research teams like our own is a good one. The other thing I wanted to underscore was the sort of you can see so often when you see the people in the documentary talking about their beliefs, particularly the anti-choice people, that is, that it's not just about abortion, it's about misogyny and control. And you can see that in the rhetoric they employ around contraception. These are anti-contraception groups, and we all know that we should all know that the best way to reduce abortions, if these people actually wanted to see fewer abortions in the world, would be to invest heavily in access to contraception. I'm the chair and co-founder of ARCC BC. We fight for free prescription contraception, and we know from reams of empirical evidence that when you remove barriers that people face when trying to access contraception, that people use contraception, there's fewer unplanned pregnancies, and as a result, there's fewer abortions. But these folks don't want that. The most chilling line that I can think of from the documentary, and this is a very competitive list, was when they asked the head of, I think it was Birthright, what he thought about contraception. His response was, that's a decision between a woman, her doctor, and her pastor. And I just had this image of two old men in a room telling a woman what to do, and it was writ large, the patriarchy in and of itself. So, this is about misogyny, it is about control, and I think the thing that's so worrying about CPCs is they wrap up their whole image, and I'll end where I started. They wrap up their whole image in this pseudo-feminist rhetoric that's like, we're helping women, women helping women, and it's not. It's a lie. It's it's pink washing misogyny, and I think that to me is the most horrifying aspect of CPCs. Their insidious nature and the way that they prey on people with profound levels of deception, and the amount of money they throw at the issue is just shocking.
The CPCs really, in that quote you mentioned, Teale, really embody that meme where it's the couple who both say, I consent, and is there someone you forgot to ask? And it's historically God, but it's in this case the CPC or your pastor. But that was fantastic. I think we covered a ton of ground, and I should have known better than to say 1 minute to either of you and then expect anything more, less.